Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me. I'm Tracy Harris, and this is At Home in My Head, the podcast that explores experience and meaning and their impact on individuals and the broader society. While I was working on the script for this episode, I got wind of an investigative piece that appeared in Reuters. I want to say that I actually heard about it when I was at the local fitness center. I like to browse on my phone while I'm on the stationary bike, and I saw a blurb from a channel called Democracy Now! I don't know if you'd consider them mainstream or alternative, but their reporting is left-leaning and rated at fact-check sites as highly reliable in their reporting. So whatever you consider them, they're a good source. And Democracy Now! Cited Reuters as the source of this particular article I was looking at. Reuters is an extremely mainstream outlet. I've said before in other episodes that I prefer to use mainstream sources when I can because relying solely on alternative sources will get pushback. I also follow several alternative sources that are not highly reliable. But I find value in them because when I do see reporting that catches my attention, I can look for other reporting at more reputable sites and verify or debunk those stories. If they pan out, generally, it's pretty disturbing, but I probably would not have learned about it because while it might be reported in mainstream media, it's not generally heavily reported. And that's too bad because often these things I can't believe I'm reading. And that's saying a lot after all the ground we've covered on unethical U.S. behaviors past and present. But this article was shocking, and it was coming out of Democracy Now!, a highly reliable source. Let me read the part that I shared out on social media in a screenshot. Reuters has revealed the U.S. military ran a secret anti-vaccination campaign in the Philippines and other nations in an effort to sow doubt about COVID vaccines made in China. The Pentagon campaign began in 2020 under Donald Trump and continued into mid-2021 after Joe Biden took office. The Pentagon set up numerous fake social media accounts on multiple platforms to target audiences in the Philippines, Central Asia, and the Middle East. The campaign also aimed to discredit masks and test kits made in China. One senior military officer involved in the campaign told Reuters, "We weren't looking at this from a public health perspective," unquote. Sometimes when I read a thing like this, I think about what I would do if I became president and this came to my attention. In fact, one of the first questions I had was, when did Biden find out about this after taking office? My next question was, he ended the program in 2021, and I'm just hearing about this in 2024. Why don't we have a president who will level with the public about shameful things our government is involved in? That is, if you became president and found out a program like this was happening and felt outraged and really thought the nation needed to take responsibility for the damage it had done, would you cover it up and stay silent? Or would you alert U.S. voters who elected you what the country is doing and swear to end all such corrupt programs? I remember once hearing someone ask how you can have a democracy without transparency, and that's a good question. If you were going to sign a contract with me, and I had information I was withholding from you that didn't make the deal look as good, and you signed it, you'd have a case for fraud and for undoing that contract with me in court. How can we vote, especially for incumbents, when they're not telling us what they're actually doing? I don't know what news you follow, but I've been fed a steady diet of anti-China for a while now from the U.S. government and media. It's only been a few alternative sources saying that what this is really about is the U.S. being unable to compete in the same markets as China and not wanting to admit it because it would prove that other systems of government can actually beat us at our own capitalist game on the global stage. I talked a little bit about observations by Yanis Varoufakis on this topic in a past episode, and I've since seen some others talking about China's market superiority. The U.S. response is to smear and slap outrageous tariffs on China. I don't know how many of you remember this, but when Trump was president and started throwing down tariffs all over the place, we got a lesson in mainstream media about why tariffs are a joke. They don't work, and they harm U.S. consumers, and they help U.S. corporate profits. In looking for a good source to explain this, I found an article at the Brookings Institute written in 2020 while Trump was still president. It pointed out that while tariffs on imports help companies that compete with foreign manufacturers, it was U.S. consumers who absorbed the added costs, and it harmed U.S. workers in industries that rely on imports. And there's no evidence they increased national security or helped the U.S. negotiate better trade agreements. Some of this is intuitive. If we drive up the cost of a cheap Chinese EV, we pay more for a Chinese EV. But there's part of it that's less intuitive. Let's say I'm a U.S. automaker and I make an EV that I can sell for $28,000 and still make a tidy profit. I can't compete with a Chinese vehicle that sells for $17,000 in the U.S. But after Biden puts a 100% tariff on it, it's now $34,000, so I'm looking super competitive. It doesn't take long, though, for me to realize that I can jack up my price to $32,000 and still be competitive. So U.S. consumers now aren't just paying more for the Chinese imports, we're paying more for EVs across the board. The other irony in the article is that it said, looking ahead to the Trump-Biden election that was coming in November of that same year, that Biden would likely put more emphasis on environmental protections than Trump when it came to tariffs. And yet, one of the main things that got jacked up were EVs, the green cars. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention a few things here. One of my friends is a huge advocate for better mass transit and rightly points out that as long as the U.S. auto lobbies push everyone to have their own cars, we're not doing the environment any favors, whether they're gas-powered or EVs. The real solution is going to lie outside of every human owning one or more private vehicles. I should also note that EVs are products that use blood minerals, and that's no small problem. If we actually weren't using what amounts to slavery in some African nations to get the raw materials to create these vehicles, nobody would manufacture an affordable one. And this gets into problems of whether we should be making things for profit or for people and for use. Is the goal transporting people or turning a profit? While any industry is profit-driven, exploitation will be a feature of that industry because that's how profit works. Somewhere in that manufacturing process, you are paying less for something than you intend to charge for it, less than you know it's worth, whether that's labor or materials. So we spent years slamming the ineffectiveness of tariffs under Trump, only to see them continue under Biden. The only winners in this are corporations. As consumers, our big prize is an overpriced vehicle that isn't really the solution to the environmental problem we're all facing. And again, we're just helping to line the pockets of wealthy capitalists in the U.S. auto industry. China is a huge and robust competitor with the U.S., not just economically, but they also challenge our tech dominance that comes with power that goes beyond money. When you have power over social media, when you can pressure companies to provide you with user information or to restrict accounts, when you can gain the complicity of the tech world, that's huge amounts of control. And the U.S. is tech dominant. And in the few areas where we aren't, we are aggressive. I talked about the TikTok situation in a past episode. There's all kinds of tension right now with China and the US, and I was even thinking the other day that the weird propaganda I'm seeing out of my own country on this reminds me in some ways of the Cold War. It's not nearly as contentious, or at least I thought it wasn't, but there are some elements that make me roll my eyes at the ridiculousness of how hard the US is trying to vilify China. Like we have any room to criticize. And I'm not saying China doesn't have its own problems. I'm just saying that the US is throwing stones at them from in front of a glass mansion. But this reporting out of Reuters goes beyond the regular bullshit I'd expect. And I wonder sometimes if that will ever wear off. Like, will I ever read some horrible thing the US has done and not feel surprised anymore? Just when I think I've gotten as cynical as I can get, I find new levels of what the f***. I'm going to start by just walking folks through the expose at Reuters point by point. Reuters, again, is about as mainstream media as you can get, operating as a wire service in addition to reporting. But this is probably the meatiest thing that I've personally ever looked at from them. The article notes that the context of this operation had COVID raging around the globe and the U.S. concerned about China's growing influence in the Philippines, which was hard hit by the virus. The U.S. military opened hundreds of fake social media accounts with the intention of spreading false information about test kits, vaccines, masks, basically every protective measure supplied by China. The accounts operated in Tagalog, the language of the region, and specifically attacked Sinovac, China's COVID vaccine. Reuters claims to have identified hundreds of X accounts that matched descriptions of the accounts used in the operations. All of them were created around the same time in 2020 and featured the hashtag ChinaAngVirus, which translates to China is the virus. The accounts claimed the vaccines and masks were fake and useless against the virus. When Reuters approached X reviewed the accounts and removed them, confirming they appeared to be part of a bot campaign. The campaign appeared to ultimately encompass Central Asia and the Middle East. Tens of thousands were dying daily during this time when some of the accounts started to specifically target Muslim communities. One tactic described in the reporting included focusing on the fear that some vaccines contain pork gelatin and so could be religiously restricted under Islamic law. The problem began under Trump, but continued under Biden, apparently even after the new administration had been alerted by social media executives. In spring of 2021, the program was halted, and by that time, it was already additionally attacking vaccines produced by other countries than China, although the article does not at this early point specify which ones. Reuters reached out to both Biden and Trump for response, but received nothing. However, they did hear back from one senior Defense Department official who confirmed the program actually happened, but that was as much as they would say. A Pentagon spokesperson was quoted as saying that the U.S. military uses a variety of platforms, including social media, to counter those malign influence attacks that are aimed at the U.S., U.S. allies, and partners. And apparently, she added, that China had started the disinformation campaign by falsely blaming the U.S. for the spread of COVID. I need to stop here for a second to react to this. I keep wondering how this was halted in 2021, and yet it's 2024, and this is the first I've heard of it. Reuters says in their article that this has not been previously reported, and I don't understand that. A big part of me hopes that someday this country will be led by a person who would come into office, get briefed on this, respond with a huge "what the f***," and immediately come to the electorate with this information to say that this is what we've been doing and it's been stopped, and that the heads will roll because the lives of people in Asia and the Middle East matter. And this is not who we want to be as a nation. We are no longer going to sacrifice human lives to protect the U.S. pharmaceutical industry or any other corporate profits. I would stand up and cheer. But let's look at what this spokesperson's comments really say. When I think about countering propaganda and disinformation, I generally think of countering it with things like the truth and real facts, not even more deadly lies. So she claims that China was blaming Washington for the virus, and I seem to remember the U.S. blaming China for it. Remember that? Our president was even calling it the China virus. And more racist labels were also thrown around. But there's a world of difference between nations blaming each other for starting it and spreading propaganda to get people to not mask, not test, and not take vaccines. One can damage a nation's reputation. The other could get millions of people killed. This is the difference between trading insults versus showing up at someone's home with a gun and mowing down their family because they insulted you. China responded by saying that they've claimed for a long time the U.S. uses social media to spread misinformation. And what's sad about this is that China also engages in propaganda. But in this case, the U.S. just handed them a whole box of ammo to use against us on the world stage. I posted a short about this, and people who saw it were shocked. One person said they were going to vet it to see if it was true, and I can't blame them. It's just about beyond belief. But in spite of getting good engagement for my little channel, it only got 26 views after being up a full day. And even though Reuters published this large expose on it, how much have you heard about this? Probably not nearly as much as a story like this should be getting. This should be blowing up the airwaves, and it's not. And this is why controlling and dominating media is not only about money, but about power. When you can keep something like this tiny and quiet, that's power. It's there, but if anybody wants to discuss it, it may not gain much traction. In Reuters reporting about responses to the news, aid and health workers, both domestic and abroad, were, not surprisingly, outraged, pointing out it put political interests above lives. The article points out evidence that when people become skeptical of a vaccine, they often become skeptical of other vaccines as well. So in sabotaging Sinovac, the propaganda likely also damaged the reputations of U.S. vaccines as well. Greg Treverton is the former chairman of the U.S. National Intelligence Council, which is involved in coordinating U.S. spy agencies. He said that what the Pentagon did, quote, crosses a line, end quote. There is no way to calculate the effectiveness of this campaign, how many people the U.S. killed with it, or how many people were influenced by it. But the followers numbered in the tens of thousands for these fake accounts. The president of the Philippines at the time threatened prison for people refusing to vaccinate because the rates of vaccination were so dismal. Here was a leader pleading with his people to do the right thing and protect themselves against this pandemic, and here we are in the U.S. doing all we can to get them killed. And for what? Because we can't take an insult? For such a powerful nation, we are looking pretty fragile in this situation. I want to directly quote this one paragraph from the article because it gives a great context for how bad the situation was that we were worsening. Quote, when he addressed the vaccination issue, the Philippines had among the worst inoculation rates in Southeast Asia. Only 2.1 million of its 114 million citizens were fully vaccinated, far short of the government's target of 70 million. By the time Duterte spoke, COVID cases exceeded 1.3 million, and almost 24,000 Filipinos had died from the virus. The difficulty in vaccinating the population contributed to the worst death rate in the region, end quote. In November 2021, Biden had stopped the program, but the death toll from the virus in the Philippines was almost 50,000 people. Yes, we stopped the program, but the damage was done. The distrust doesn't stop just because we stopped telling the lies. The people who believed them are still out there promoting them. Things like this take on lives of their own. But now imagine that a U.S. president had stood up and exposed this. Imagine that some of this damage could have been undone in early 2021 if people in the Philippines had been told that these lies were U.S. propaganda and not fact-based. If we had owned this and taken accountability at the time we stopped it, instead of stopping quietly, we might have made at least some of those believers reconsider and realize they'd been hoodwinked and maybe go get a vaccine. Our silent slinking away from this likely did a lot of further damage. Apparently, top U.S. diplomats in the area objected to the program, which means they knew. and they did not come forward. Again, how many links in this chain could have mitigated this but did nothing? Perhaps the most disgusting quote in the whole article reads as follows, quote, "We weren't looking at this from a public health perspective," said a senior military officer involved in the program. "We were looking at how we could drag China through the mud," unquote. Isn't that the problem in a nutshell? Why not just say that to the United States these lives did not matter? We didn't care how many people got killed as long as China looked bad, even if we had to make things up to make them look bad. And that's another problem here. If they had any real dirt, they'd have used it. But they didn't. So they really were just trying to make China look bad, because in this case, China wasn't actually doing anything bad. If they were, again, we would have used the real problem instead of having to invent problems. China insulted the US. So the US went to Asia and the Middle East and killed a bunch of uninvolved people. Because that's forever how we roll in this country. This quote is also interesting. Remember what I said about how this had a bit of a Cold War feel to it? That's what I grew up in, and this reminds me of that. And here, Reuters says that, quote, "Some U.S. national security officials have pushed for a return to the kind of aggressive clandestine propaganda operations against rivals that the United States wielded during the Cold War," unquote. If I had to guess, and that's all it would be, a guess, I'd say some of those people have influence because it has a tangible feel to it. In fact, folks in my audience who also recall the Cold War, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on this, and if any of what's happening here reminds you of that as well. And here's where it gets even more interesting, and we see a big divide between China and the US attitudes about how to deal with the pandemic. China planned to send masks, ventilators, and vaccines to countries that needed them most. And in May 2020, they said the vaccine, Sinovac, that was still under development, would be supplied globally as a public good. They said they wanted to ensure developing countries had access. And for nearly a year, Sinovac was the only vaccine available in the Philippines before U.S. vaccines were released. Compare this to the U.S. and our Operation Warp Speed. We made it clear that people in the U.S. would be the first recipients of the vaccines, and whatever was left over, pharmaceutical companies could then offer to developing nations for a price. Lawrence Gostin, professor of medicine at Georgetown University, is referenced in the article describing how the U.S. allowed these companies to, quote, "play hardball," end quote, with these developing nations, charging high rates for U.S. vaccines. China's offer, basically, made the U.S. look bad, because we were behaving badly in the face of a global crisis. Instead of being global community-minded, we were isolating and showing how selfish and exploitative we could be. Broiling in the background was that U.S. relations with the Philippines apparently were stressed, and U.S. military presence in the region was being threatened by the then President Duterte, who wanted to cancel the agreement that allowed our troops to be maintained there. In addition to the carrot, China was also using a bit of a stick with some military flexing in regional territory that was disputed. And Duterte apparently didn't have the firepower to argue, so he struck an uneasy deal there, and part of that was China's promise to help with vaccines. To quote the Reuters article again, quote, "We didn't do a good job sharing vaccines with partners," a senior U.S. military officer directly involved in the campaign in Southeast Asia told Reuters. "So what was left to us was to throw shade on China's," end quote. I mean, yeah, that's it in a nutshell. We acted like greedy, selfish shits. And when China didn't, that really made us look bad. If you don't want to look like shit on the world stage, maybe don't act like shit on the world stage. In this case, at least, China looked better because their position was better. They beat us fair and square. They didn't do this to us, we did this to us. And then, when we realized we didn't look good, we decided to try and crap on the nation doing the right thing because we were jealous. And in our jealous rage, we killed the people China said they would help. We sure showed them, didn't we? I want to insert here that I'm including a link to the Reuters article, which my regular listeners already would assume, but I really encourage you to check it out, if for no other reason than to see the social media images they include with this article from some of these propaganda accounts. It's worth a look. I'm also going to cite a piece of information here, not because it's key to the article, but because we really need to know as many names and faces of the people responsible for this as possible. So, shout out to Senior U.S. Military Commander responsible for Southeast Asia, Special Operations Command Pacific General Jonathan Braga, who pushed this up the chain to his bosses in Washington as a good way for the U.S. to push back. Again, that's Jonathan, Jonathan, Braga, Braga, just like it sounds. I only wish I had the names of his bosses who approved this shit show, so that I could share those as well. Half a dozen senior State Department officials working in that same region apparently raised objections because obvious reasons. And again, apparently, once the decision was made, they opted for silent complicity. Any one of them could have leaked this to the press, not even exposing themselves, done so anonymously. How many lives might have been saved if just one of them had a spine? I wish I had their names to share too. They stood by, they watched this murderous plot unfolding for a year and did nothing about it. Earlier, I mentioned that the article didn't mention specific other countries whose vaccines we disparaged, but I just now saw a caption under one of the Arabic Disinformation Post images that says Russia was another country we tried to undermine. Oh wow, okay, so here's some juicy news. Apparently, those senior State Department officials in the past would have been able to stop this operation based simply on their positions and authority. But in 2019, our then Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, signed a secret order that made the Pentagon's activity in this regard one of, quote, active combat, unquote. This let the Pentagon go around the State Department in this case, and it also expanded their authority in other regards, but this is what matters in this context. So Braga got his wish, and in Tampa they set up shop to get this plan into action. I wish we could get the names of everyone who worked on these accounts, and the contractors and the military personnel who were behind each account, but I'm going to say that that list will never see the light of day, and if anybody wants to take that bet, reach out. The next few paragraphs just talk about the history of PSYOPs and how it's been used. But this current revelation has a whole different flavor, because this isn't about tactical battlefield advantages. It's about making ourselves look bad, providing China with golden opportunities to step in where we failed to step in and look great without even trying, and then getting so angry about our fuck-up that we killed a bunch of people who had nothing to do with this. We weren't at war here. What is it with us that we always think that killing a bunch of poor people or non-white people is the way to improve our situation? We couldn't make ourselves look better because we weren't about to do the right thing, so all we had left was to try and stop anyone else from successfully doing the right thing. So that's what we did. How dare China offer the world vaccines? Like, instead of saying, hey, we could offer to supply the world vaccines as a global good and beat China that way by being better than China, but we were more like, nah, let's just be our shitty selves and ruin China so they can't do a good thing either. In summer of 2020 is when we moved from Southeast Asia to the Middle East. China had clarified they weren't using pork gelatin in the vaccine and it was fine for Muslims. And even some Muslim leaders told adherents that since it was to save lives, it was okay to take the vaccine even if it did contain pork product. But the U.S. decided to glom onto that to use it to spread Muslim-specific anti-vax propaganda. And it was also at this point that social media companies started to get an idea something was odd about these accounts out of Tampa. As social media companies started to recognize a problem, Meta specifically went to the Pentagon to alert them that Facebook staff were easily able to recognize these accounts as fake U.S. military accounts. Facebook told them it violated the platform's policies to use fake accounts to spread COVID disinformation. The military claimed the accounts were being used for counterterrorism, and Facebook left them up. The article is ambiguous here as to whether the accounts were used for both COVID disinformation and counterterrorism. I can't tell if the Pentagon was saying they would stop the COVID disinformation but needed the accounts for counterterrorism, or if the Pentagon just straight up lied to maintain the accounts. But the anti-vax campaign didn't stop and was still going strong when Biden took office and continued on into 2021. Meta wasn't happy that the disinformation didn't stop, and Facebook conference called Biden's National Security Council right after Biden took office, and the reporting is that the conversation didn't go well. One senior administration official said they were shocked and that the incoming administration was pro-vaccine and didn't want to spread vaccine hesitancy in developing countries. This still leaves me wondering why then they wouldn't expose this program to say that these rumors are lies put out by the prior administration, disavow them, and alert the world of the danger that we had put them in. Why wouldn't someone who cares about vaccination in the pandemic do this one simple thing to help mitigate the damage we had already done? If you're driving recklessly and you hit a car full of people and drive them off into a ditch where you can see that they need help and some are injured, you should stop and render aid. It sucks to be responsible for that and to face consequences for the damage that you caused, but it's the only right thing to do. The wrong thing to do is to drive off and say you'll drive more carefully in the future, leaving them all bleeding in the ditch. But it sounds like this was the Biden administration's response. The description of the halting of the program is sketchy, with some accounts continuing to spread disinformation even after they technically should have been stopped, and there is no accounting for or explanation about why that was allowed to continue. But the announcement that a lot of disinformation had come from the U.S. could have gone a long way to make some kind of amends for the damage we'd done. According to a senior Defense Department official, Reuters' calls and questions prompted an internal review at the end of 2021. The way the article describes it is that a review, quote, uncovered the anti-vaccine operation. The probe also turned up other social and political messaging that was many, many leagues away from any acceptable military objective. The official would not elaborate, end quote. I would really love someone to explain to me how the Pentagon had all this going on for a year, but the Defense Department didn't know about it until a news outlet started asking them questions. And I'm not being facetious. I literally didn't realize that the Defense Department doesn't know what the Pentagon does. I really need to educate myself on this structure. And how scary is it that they found more that they wouldn't comment on? Other groups also caught wind of something fishy. Academics at Stanford recognized some of the phony accounts, and the Washington Post reported on the battle over the COVID origins and the fake social media accounts. But Reuters was the first outlet to explain that the program eventually became anti-vax propaganda. The Pentagon has rescinded parts of the secret order that shifted the authority away from the regional ambassadors that I mentioned earlier. So the decisions are back to being more balanced, and it incorporates other restrictions, but it's not really fleshed out entirely in this article. And here's an interesting note. Part of the investigation's findings was that the contractor, and here's the name to remember, General Dynamics IT, didn't take sufficient steps to hide the origin of the accounts. It also found that the military needed better control of the General Dynamics IT contractors. A big part of me thinks, thank God they didn't. Because had the operation been more solid, we might never have heard about it at all. And these people investigating would still be in the dark. It's almost like saying you investigated a mob hit and you found that the hitman could have done a better job of disposing of the body so that it wouldn't be found. I mean, the real investigation here should be about how an atrocity like this could even happen without people knowing about it who should have known about it, or why we were doing something like this to begin with. How did this toxic horse ever get approval to get out of the gate? And why was the government keeping this quiet after being shocked and shutting down the program? Why weren't the nations impacted alerted? Why was the U.S. electorate kept in the dark? Why is there such a grotesque lack of transparency and accountability? It almost sounds like this operation wasn't illegal. And what does that say about our laws? That we can kill, likely, tens of thousands of people to make another nation look bad, because we aren't going to do what it takes to look good. General Dynamics IT declined to comment. Again, that's General Dynamics IT in Tampa. Let me just read to you the last two dismal paragraphs straight from this Reuters story. Quote, "Nevertheless, the Pentagon's clandestine propaganda efforts are set to continue. In an unclassified strategy document last year, top Pentagon generals wrote that the U.S. military could undermine adversaries such as China and Russia using disinformation spread across social media, false narratives disguised as news, and similar subversive activities to weaken societal trust by undermining the foundations of government. And in February, the contractor that worked on the Anti-Vax campaign, General Dynamics IT, won a $493 million contract. Its mission? To continue providing clandestine influence services for the military." Unquote. So here's what I've been grappling with. I keep seeing these memes and messages saying democracy is on the line in 2024 and we have to vote to save our democracy. But how can this be a democracy if we have no idea what our government is doing? Is there anyone listening who thinks that this information, that the U.S. was killing people in Asia and the Middle East to smear China, wouldn't matter to at least some voters? That finding out something like this might not sway some votes? Again, let's go back to that scenario I asked you to imagine previously, that you and I are entering into a contract. I have information that could negatively impact your willingness to sign the document, but I keep it to myself, and the contract is executed. Then you find out that I was hiding key information. You now have grounds for a lawsuit against me for fraud. But more importantly, the heart of that law is that consent isn't consent if it's not informed. What you thought you were consenting to wasn't the actual deal, and I knew that, but you didn't. And so your consent doesn't count because you didn't know what was actually going on. I remember hearing someone say something once that was like, secrecy and democracy are incompatible, or there is no democracy without transparency. You get the idea. How can our votes count if we don't know what we're voting for? If our government is doing shit like this and hiding it from us, then what we think we're voting for isn't the whole picture. Just like the fraudulent contract deal, they're asking us to sign on to policies, but hiding other policies from us. That renders our consent invalid. I can't consent to vote for a candidate who is lying to me or withholding relevant information that would impact my decision to vote for them. That's fraud. And if my vote isn't valid, then the outcome isn't valid. The elected representatives are illegitimate, and the state is illegitimate as a result. I think I recall quoting Chris Hedges in the episode on Occupy Wall Street saying something about this illegitimacy in the state's response to that protest. But I'm not going back to find it. I just know that votes do not count when the people we're voting for are hiding highly relevant information from us. I read a meme a while back that said something like, "The United States isn't so much a country as it is 3 corporations wearing a trench coat." And I think that about sums it up. That's it for this episode of At Home in My Head, exploring experience and meaning in individuals and the broader society. Like and subscribe if you enjoy these talks, and in the meantime, stay safe, be well, and never stop exploring.